My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I want to talk about 3 indicators that you or your partner might be presenting with traits of narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. Now, if you have these traits, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would get a full-blown diagnosis. So let's just put that out front as a disclaimer. But I think this is really important to look at, and we need to look at it from a very non-judgmental point of view. I see many YouTube channels that talk about narcissism and people with borderline personality disorder. And unfortunately, most of the people doing these shows that I can see, they're not licensed mental health clinicians. They're unfortunately some angry, bitter people that have been in relationships, and they start doing shows in order to get out their anger, their frustration, or whatever it is, and they become quite popular, and good for them. But not all the information is correct, number one, and I also think that it's an attempt to vilify people that do have some of these traits that we're going to talk about, but it doesn't really talk about the other side of it. In other words, with a narcissist, let's just say somebody does have narcissistic personality disorder, there's another person there that's enabling that. And the same thing with borderline personality disorder. We can talk about how negative it is to be around somebody with those types of traits. But they have a tendency to vilify that person, but they don't do anything to empower the person who's putting up with it. So I would rather talk about it straight and look at some indicators that do happen to present themselves in relationships without doing any name calling and without trying to be overly judgmental to anybody. So that's the disclaimer for today. Now, if we do look at the DSM, to look at the criteria for NPD or BPD, it helps us, and it can inform treatment, and it can help a clinician to be able to diagnose somebody. But I think it leaves out a lot for a quote-unquote a normal person to see in a relationship. And I don't think the DSM helps people to really see the traits that occur and present in a real relationship. So I want to take a look at that. Now, in neuro-linguistic programming, they talk about how the map does not equal the territory. An example of that would be is that you can look at a map and you could see that there's an area where there's mountains on it, but it doesn't give you any idea of what it would be like to try to climb those mountains or to drive through those mountains or what the weather would be like. So it doesn't offer that much information. And I think for most people in relationships, to look up information in the DSM is kind of like the same thing. The map does not equal the territory. So I'm going to take a look at 3 indicators today that you're not going to see in the DSM, but you can see it for yourself if you feel like you or your partner have some of these traits. And again, not to be judgmental, because a lot of these traits that you see, they occur because of complex post-traumatic stress in early childhood. And so we're all doing our best to find the love that we need and find the attachment that we need. And you'll see some really interesting ways that people have tried to receive that attachment. So let's take a look at the first indicator. Do you have difficulty making boundaries for yourself? That's A. And B would be, do you have difficulty respecting the boundaries of others? So we have to ask the question, what causes difficulty with boundaries on either side? And the answer is typically people's BS, right? So somebody's going, what does that mean, BS? Well, from my point of view, BS means people's belief systems. The belief systems that we learn in childhood, which very much become unconscious programming, that's what causes the problems that we might or might not have with boundaries. For example, so let's take 2 children. So we have 2 children whose boundaries have been broken, and they live in inconsistent, stressful, say, a very invalidating environment. So what might their core belief be? because they don't have the ability to look at their parents and say, wow, my parents are very deficient. They're not ready to be parents. They don't know how to love a child. They have trouble with emotions, so they don't allow me to have emotions. They don't have the ability to do that. So they think something's got to be wrong with them. And they're trying to somehow create that attachment or create something to where they're actually loved by their parents and they get attention. So the core beliefs could be shame. It could be that they become extremely insecure. It could be that they have an I'm not good enough thought about themselves. And then they start to think, I have to do things or I have to be a certain way to get the love and the attention that I need from my caregivers. So what does this create in let's say a romantic relationship as they get older? Well, let's take a look at codependent or a selfless type of position. These people tend to be afraid of confrontation. They're afraid of disappointing other people. They're afraid not to be liked, and they prioritize the needs of everybody else more than their own needs. And they do manipulate people because they're not always being honest or authentic, right? But they're manipulating people to join with them, to be liked, to come closer to them. So that's one side. On the flip side of that, we can have narcissism. Again, narcissistic personality disorder, or we could say narcissistic traits. And a person like this, they do want to be loved, but they also want to be feared. They tend to be grandiose, entitled, and they attempt to dominate other people. Unfortunately, these types of people are not trying to join with people. They're moving against people, and typically they're looking to exploit other people. And they are always looking for a way to use people for personal gain. And they disrespect people's boundaries. And they manipulate people to subjugate people and to make them on the lower side and always put them on the top side. So let's take a look at borderline traits. People who have borderline traits, again, not necessarily borderline personality disorder, but borderline traits, they tend to disrespect other people's boundaries. And they do this because it triggers their fear of rejection and fear of abandonment. And this happens because if they hear the word no, they feel it's a rejection of them. They take it very, very personally. And they're always hyper vigilant towards anybody doing something against them, perceived or real, because they're afraid that the relationship might end. And so they attack very quickly. Not to be disrespectful, but let me use an example of this. If you've ever seen a cat, cats are very hypervigilant, right? So if you see a cat walk into a room, they're always scanning the room for something that could hurt them. And if you, when the cat's not in the room, if you were to take a knick-knack and just move it a few inches to the left or to the right, when a cat walks into the room, they'll actually scan the room because they're looking for something that's dangerous or something that could happen to them. They will notice that you moved this knick-knack 2 or 3 inches, and they'll freeze almost, and then they'll creep up on it. If you have borderline traits, they're always looking for the next thing that could hurt them. It's been very much described as, let's say someone who goes out in the sun, right, one day, and they stay out for too long, and they get this really harsh sunburn, so they're extremely sensitive. Then the next day they go out in the sun, every little ray that hits them for, even if it's just a second, they feel it intensely. And that is what it's like to have borderline traits. And so they're always scanning for somebody who could hurt them. So that's the first indicator. So let's look at the second indicator. Do you have difficulty with conflict resolution? Most people that are healthy can have an argument and they kind of just figure it out and they put it away. And it's not a real issue. Or they can be mature enough to agree to disagree. And again, that argument or disagreement gets put away and probably doesn't affect their life very much. People just move on from that. But let's say you're codependent now. Again, you're moving towards people. That's your trauma trait that you've unconsciously chosen in childhood. Codependents tend to give too much to keep the peace. And what this does is because it never ends the conflict, because it does in the short time, but in the long haul, they're not getting their needs met either because they're not stating them. So what does that do? It brings out a lot of anger. Usually inside they don't let it out because they want to be liked, so they don't show their anger. So what does that do? It brings out a lot of resentment. And so when this brings out anger and resentment, on top of not having their basic needs met, it's going to create a situation where it's very, very rare where an actual conflict gets resolved in a healthy way. Again, let's look at the opposite side. A person with narcissistic traits, they're moving against people all the time. So they tend to be intolerant of other people's views. They look at differences of opinion and any type of words against them or just something different. They look at that as a threat on their ego, and they can't compromise. I mean, technically they can compromise, but it's not part of their skill set to do that. They think that compromise is equal to like giving in and showing their weakness and then allowing somebody else to be smarter than them or better or superior in some way. And they cannot let that happen. So typically with a narcissist, it's either their way or no way. So does that resolve conflict? Not really, because the only way to resolve a conflict with a narcissist is to give in. And so again, that means one person's needs are not being met, so that's not going to be helpful at all. So let's look at the borderline now. They tend to base their beliefs on their feelings and not necessarily facts. And this becomes difficult if there's an argument with a person who has borderline traits. Because they go in with the feeling first, they have to justify how they feel. So they're going to manipulate and change the facts and argue things all the way through. And if they become too invested in how they feel, they're not going to be very invested in the facts that got them to that position in the first place, because they would be embarrassed. And again, that slight embarrassment, it goes to their shame and their guilt and not feeling good enough at their core. So it's not something that they can admit to very easily. If they're having a conversation with a partner, what happens is when they're trying to listen to somebody, they have difficulty doing it because they'll take a look at that difference of opinion, those difference of views, the thought of looking at the world a little different, and they take that as they're being manipulated. They take it as someone's trying to control them. And again, this comes from deep into their childhood. So can they resolve arguments? I would say rarely. It's very, very difficult. And the other thing that happens with this over and over again is if you are dealing with actually both a narcissist or a person who has borderline traits, they have a rage. They can get very angry because they have to win at all costs. It's not personal against the person. It's that they can't take that loss, which they consider to be a loss. And sometimes compromise, or actually all the time, compromise is considered to be a loss to them because it's an admission that they're not perfect and they're trying to put out that false self. So if you're dealing with someone with borderline traits, for example, one disagreement, unfortunately, can bring back a whole bunch of other disagreements. And it makes it very difficult to create security. It makes it very difficult to create trust in the relationship because you never know when the shoe's going to drop, so to speak, and then everything that you thought you resolved in the past will come back to get you. So just to give you a little visual, if you have two healthy individuals, they can have a discussion. And what happens is that somehow everything in that situation gets resolved, or as I said before, that you can agree to disagree and it doesn't really affect your relationship. So let's say here's all the arguments and all the resentments and grudges that a competent couple has. in, let's say, today's date, whatever today's date is. And as you can see, it's empty. They know how to deal with conflict resolution. Now, if you're dealing with someone who has narcissistic or borderline traits, it can start off as empty. But let's say you have an argument today, and we start the argument, and here that is. And if you have narcissistic traits or borderline traits, you don't want to hear the other person's point of view. You have to be right. You start to rage. You may start to devalue the other person. You try to make them look stupid, sound stupid. You put them down in every which way. You might name call them. You might take some things that they've done in the past and try to put a negative light on it. You might say that they're bad at whatever they do. Maybe their work, maybe they're bad at being a family person, maybe they were bad at school a long time ago, and maybe they'll tell you that the only reason why they're with you is because you're the only one, that they're the only one that will put up with your garbage, right? So they try to devalue you in every which way possible. So this argument's not going away. But to make matters worse, what they'll do is they'll say, so you remember that disagreement that we had in the year 2000? I'm blaming you for that too. Remember in 2005 when I wanted to go to dinner and you didn't take me to the exact place I wanted to? Okay, we get that. Remember the vacation that we were supposed to go on, but the pandemic caused that problem that we couldn't go on vacation, but I'm going to blame you. And so we do this. So now you went from one argument to all these. So what could happen typically in a narcissistic or a borderline rage is that every argument, disagreement, even the ones that they heard about from your family, end up feeling like this. And now you're still trying to figure out, can we solve this problem that we started with today? And yet now we have all this. So can you resolve a conflict with someone with narcissistic or borderline traits? Well, that's the essence of why I want to do this show, because it's an indicator that you have these traits. So we really have to look at what's happening here, because if you can't listen to people and you have to put them down and you have to go into a rage and try to hurt people because everything that they think that is different than you might consider to be an insult, there will be no resolution of anything. So let's take a look at the third indicator that one or both partners might be suffering with some type of childhood trauma that's presenting itself today. And so the question would be, do you or your partner have difficulty being happy or supportive of each other's success? Now again, one of the reasons why I'm putting this in here is because you're not going to see that in the DSM, but it might show up in your life and you're not going to know what it is or why. And so we're going to go over that today. So let's take a look at it from 3 different points of view. So let's take a look at it from narcissistic point of view. If you have a partner that does well and they start to do better than you and you have narcissistic traits, your perceived superiority is going to be damaged here. And typically people with narcissistic traits, they're not willing to be a cheerleader for other people because they need the spotlight. They want the spotlight themselves, they can't share it. So the question might be, is it possible to get into a relationship with a successful person if you're a narcissist? All right? Do they only pick people that are way below them? And that's not true. Narcissists can choose people who are very successful because it makes them look good temporarily. But if they're in a relationship with them for a long time, they will slowly start to chip away at that because it becomes too difficult for their ego to be with someone who's getting more attention than them, or for someone that they perceive might make more money than them, might just be more talented than them. It would be a very difficult situation. So yes, they would start to devalue their partner. Let's look at it from a BPD, or again, borderline trait perspective. So A partner's success scares them because it triggers their fear of rejection and fear of abandonment. As a partner moves up in status and becomes more valuable, the BPD becomes more insecure about themselves and the relationship. So look at it like this, right? You have two equal people in a relationship. A person with borderline traits sees their partner maybe get a raise at work. You know, maybe they graduate from something, you know, and then they become more valuable to society. A person with borderline traits has that inner insecurity that they're not good enough. So they think, wow, this person is really, they're growing in a different direction that I'm not going, that they're going to get rid of me now. So they would see that as a threat to them. So the success of their partner actually triggers negativity in them. And that's why it would be a difficult deal to have a relationship with somebody like that. So they would really need to look at that. Because again, it's triggering their low self-esteem. And so although they would want to be happy for their partner, inside it's really difficult for them to do that because they feel like their partner is getting ready to leave them. So let's look at it from a complex post-traumatic stress position, which by the way, NPD and BPD are derivatives of that, but it does present in other ways as well. So if you have complex stress, it does trigger shame, insecurity, low self-esteem, and the I'm not good enough belief system all over again. And it can do that. So again, it's very difficult if you have those traits and you're not working on them. When your partner does well, it's not going to work out altogether. So let's take a look at, from the opposite, let's take a look at a codependent. Codependents always try to get along. They tend to give too much in relationships in order to make the relationship work. So in this sense, this is why I think a lot of successful people do like people who are codependents, because they let them do whatever they want to do. So let's say a person says, listen, I've got this new job and I'm moving up the ladder, but I'm going to have to travel all the time. A codependent would probably, even though they may not be totally happy inside, they would say, you know, you need to go for it. It'll hold a relationship together. It makes you happy. You do that. So in that sense, I would say that a codependent, in that sense, would actually be helping out the relationship itself as in totality. They would have to figure that in their own psychology, though, if it's really actually bothering them inside, if not seeing their partner that much bothers them or not. They would have to actually be honest with themselves to be able to figure that out. But in the time that it would be happening, it would be productive for the other person for sure, because they wouldn't have to deal with, say, insecurities and the jealousy, although it might be there, but the codependent would probably not state it. So I hope today's show has been valuable today. Again, I don't want to be judgmental in any way like some of these other channels are. I think NPD and BPD are very serious type of symptoms that you would see from early childhood trauma, and these can be worked on. They just have to be able to go to a therapist and not look at everything as a challenge to their psyche, as a challenge to their self-esteem. They should be able to sit in a room with somebody and to be able to have a discussion and to be able to be with another person, to be able to accept different points of view, because everybody's entitled to their point of view and it's not personal. So I hope you found today's show valuable. If you could subscribe, I would enjoy that a lot. And please tell a friend to subscribe also. I would like that even more. Thank you. I'll see you next time. Bye now.